Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of the Teacher Starting Fires personal podcast series. For this episode, we've got a really interesting topic. It's a post from Reddit by a teacher who is experiencing something that probably a lot of people can relate to. They've been thrown into the deep end and they're having some major classroom management issues. So we're going to be talking about that post today. I hope you enjoy. Okay, hey everybody, this is Austin and Jesse with the Teacher Starting Fires personal podcast series. Our episode today is about an art teacher who just started teaching, and in fact, they have never taught before. And so they're having some classroom management issues, and they posted on Reddit recently, about 16 hours ago as we record this, and they put some specific questions out to the community, and we decided to answer them as best we could from the Teacher Starting Fires perspective. So just to give a little overview of what we're talking about here, this person has never taught before, although they do have a background in the arts. They're not trained in teaching art exactly. And actually, this sums it up pretty well. This is a quote from their principal. They say, we kicked another teacher out of their room so you can have an art room full time. School starts in 3 days. Enjoy. So this was the message they got 3 days before school started. The person was expecting to have art on a cart style program where they would go and teach in the classroom with other teachers present. But instead, they're teaching all by themselves in a room. And on top of that, they have to create their curriculum, and they're teaching K through 8. So they have a huge range. So with all that together, Jesse, I'm gonna invite you to chime in. So what are the main issues that you see with this teacher's challenges right now?
Yeah, so looking through the post, and we'll put a link to the original post in the various descriptions where we post this. But the key issues that I see for this teacher, like you said, they were expecting, they're essentially in working for a company that outsources teachers to schools without an art program. So they thought they were going to be jumping into classrooms. So instead, they're getting essentially a full-time teacher position without any form of teacher training. And there's a reason that teachers are required to have typically about 2 years of training for that master's, or at least the teaching certificate worked in with their first 4-year degree. And they've got a few other issues going on here. And so they talk about the main things I see here. You've got no teacher training. He's also, or she, but this teacher's working with a huge range of ages. So they're working at a K through 8. And so they're expecting to sub in various schools and move back and forth, but instead they're working with kindergartners through 8th grade. And as you know, you even have different endorsements, completely different training programs if you're trying to be a primary school teacher, because you need a lot more of the early childhood development. The childhood development up through 5th grade essentially is that primary certification, and then moving on into the secondary certificate where it's more content based. So you've got this huge range of ages as well. And like they talked about, they have a film, an animation degree, which is, an arts background, but in no way teaching a variety of, 9 years of art to students at a public school. So they essentially have no subject or content mastery in their area, which obviously would be difficult for any teacher. So they're starting off with quite a few issues. Some of the main descriptions, kind of the symptoms of what all of these things are leading to. He has the younger students play the game of, they come in well behaved with their teacher. As soon as their teacher's gone, they freak out and start yelling and screaming and need help and want to hug him and all of that constantly. And then as soon as another teacher comes back in, they all behave again. Kind of the perfect example of why he should have been going into classrooms, or she should have been going into classrooms and helping the teacher who was already managing the class instead of giving them the full classroom management load as well. The older students, as you get into 8th grade, of course, are being too cool to do anything. And it sounds like he has a 40-person class, or almost 40 of them. So possibly that 35 max that's in a lot of districts. Yeah, so the older students are playing too cool for school and is a very large class. And then at the end, it's mentioned in there, and it'd be unfair to neglect it. He does mention that they're a white teacher in a heavily minority school, and some other teachers have even said that the students don't respect him because all their parents make fun of white people all the time behind their back, which obviously we can't comment on their specific situation in schools and minorities and all that, but having taught at at 100% minority school for 5 years in an at-risk area, we can, I have some perspectives on kind of interacting with that idea of races looking down on the white teacher, making fun of the white teacher as well. So we can chat about that really briefly.
Yeah, that is something important to mention, although it definitely doesn't have to be a barrier to improving this situation, right?
Oh, absolutely not. No, none. And I think that's part of especially coming from an outside of teaching role into this. Every one of these things is both a completely valid reason to be struggling. Like, nobody who has no teaching experience and a huge range of ages and no content mastery should expect great results immediately. Honestly, we're fortunate that people are stepping up and filling in these programs and working with, nonprofits and organizations that help fill in these electives that are otherwise being removed. So to this teacher, thank you for stepping up and becoming a teacher without necessarily, having that been your life purpose for the last 10 years or whatever, but to come in and be willing to help and be in a place where you can have a huge impact. But yeah, definitely each one of these things is a very justified reason to be struggling a great deal, but also not a reason to let the students crush you. And there are some tricks, some tips that we can definitely address, pretty much right off the bat, that can help balance out some of this. And as usual, it's more coming from our the Teachers Starting Fires. Like, the whole thing we focus on is the adventure mindset. It's that mindset that adventure educators have when they're teaching climbing and mountain biking and any hands-on skill, which makes art especially well suited, because art does not have, especially the K through 8 level, is not going to have a huge amount of specific core content that they have to know, or specific facts he has to teach, or she has to teach, but it has hands-on activities, and it has all the same advantages as well as difficulties of adventure education.
Yeah, definitely. And so as we transition into some practical solution steps and solution oriented conversation, let's look at, I want to dig a little bit more into this post, because it looks like that this teacher is trying to reach out to their colleagues and get some tips. And as I read here, it looks like they were advised to make a rules poster. So they did an art oriented rules poster. They talk about procedures. They try to implement consequences in the class. They've done a lot of different things that were suggested by the other teachers in their schools, which is good. That's great, right? But they're still struggling despite all of that work. So what would you say to that? Why do you think that they're still struggling with classroom management, even though they've taken the advice of a lot of the other teachers at the school?
What comes across to me the most reading through the post, especially that section where they meet kids at the door and tell them what you expect, and try bribing kids, and watch for a mystery student who gets a prize, and all these different elements that might be a beneficial piece to add on to classroom management, or add on into a class for a little bit of extra control. But kind of the impression I get is that they've been, without the teacher background, they've been handed just a ton of different tiny pieces of good practice or best practice from other teachers, and told to apply them all at once. And I think, and this is, I think, true in all schools, but especially middle school, and then also especially for me, the at-risk students, we're so capable of seeing through any sort of charade, that like the main pieces of advice, and we have a couple specific what to do in the classroom pieces that we'll give as well. But what I'd start with is being authentic, and what that would mean in this case is like these students, especially the older ages, are going to see through any attempt to bribe them to be good, or to trying to like reverse psychology them into doing what you want, and instead falling back on the genuine desire to help them, the genuine truth that it's difficult right now because of the way they're behaving, and being somewhat open with the students about that, and not necessarily talking to them about the difficulties, but just not trying to deny the truth of how difficult the situation is with the students. And I think that's what comes across right now, and like we normally talk about with Teachers Starting Fires, is that need to step back a little bit from the daily content and focus on, essentially that expedition mindset that like, it doesn't matter how much climbing or mountain biking or hiking or whatever you're doing, if you haven't built a good group team dynamic that, in the case of expeditions, can wake up together and cook together and pack together and clean together. But in the case of a class, that essential behavior is, behaving and cooperating and working together, and creating a solid relationship at this point is so much more important than any of the art or the curriculum. And especially, in an art class, you have a whole lot of options that you might not have in a core content class to take a few days off, or take 10 to 20 minutes every day in class and use that specifically to build up a strong relationship, and kind of help turn this class around from the place where everybody's crazy to a place where like students are excited to come in and just naturally behave well, instead of trying to get tricked into behaving well.
Definitely. So it sounds like, if I could kind of sum up generally what you're saying, it sounds like they were given a toolbox, so to speak, and asked to build a house without knowing anything about carpentry.
To some extent. I mean, on that metaphor, it's almost like every single teacher in the school, who all have slightly different, methods of building whatever they're building, they all gave him different, not necessarily matching tools. And one tool in here, he found a few articles that says, totally jump right into art, rules on the first day suck. And thankfully, lots of people in Reddit also disagreed with that. And, I think anybody in teaching, especially in some type of other than like really high SES school, that's not going to be a good option. So we can throw that tool out right away. A lot of the other tools might work, but if they're not your tools and they don't fit, what you're trying to build, then it's not going to be, many of those tools are not as universal as it should be.
And if you don't know the foundation that you're trying to build on, then anything you put together is going to fall apart pretty quick anyway.
Right. And, I guess keeping with that construction metaphor, the same idea that like when we look at a subject, it's essentially, you think about math or art or science or whatever, the subject and the content in that class are really like the very exterior appearance of this house that you're building. And especially coming into this teacher position, if this person's focused only on getting that art content to the students, they're trying to put up siding without ever building, the foundation and building the framework and the walls and putting the windows in and putting up the, weatherproofing and all that. They're just trying to like stack siding up. And of course that's never going to work. And other teachers are handing them tools to help them add siding, but that doesn't work if you haven't built a foundation. And so I think, more than anything, it sounds like we could probably offer a few tools to build that foundation. And then it really doesn't matter what you're teaching. So you can teach art, you can teach a bunch of different subjects on a solid foundation, and then no longer have these kind of crazy classroom management issues.
Yeah, that sounds great. So let's talk about that foundation a little bit more. What does that look like in this specific situation from the Teachers Starting Fires perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, the practical steps. First, I mean, looking at those issues, like teacher training, obviously 2 years of teacher training is going to be great, But I still think a huge amount of teacher training comes from experience and just interacting with people, and especially interacting with youth. And I've seen people who have never been teachers come in and do surprisingly well, and I've seen teachers with a master's degree do surprisingly poorly, depending on the student and the population and the age and all that. So, the teacher training is not going to make or break this experience. The same thing, the range of ages is definitely difficult, but, you're going to be adjusting your control method. You're going to be adjusting your interaction method. And just like when we taught rock climbing, we had essentially third graders that could be absolutely amazing, fearless climbers, and you had eighth graders who were terrified, and vice versa. You had third graders who just didn't have the strength or effort to climb up, and you had eighth graders who were, moving on towards competitions. And so at that range of ages, it's part of what you're looking at, but you have to treat each student individually, just like always. Although as a class, there's going to be slightly different methods, and they can get some advice from the teachers of those classes as well. And finally, that no content mastery, in terms of especially kind of the high school or secondary level of art, I would not be worried because like at the high schools I've been at, even at some, really top end high schools, the econ teacher was often only a chapter or two ahead of the students, essentially relearning these classes that of course they passed in college. So at the K through 8 art level, there's absolutely no reason to think that, without that full art background, that you cannot, excuse me. There's no reason to think that without that art content, you cannot still impact these students in an incredibly positive way. And at that K through 8 level, again, like some students might be there to learn art, but most of these students are there to learn interactions with each other and prepare as students and individuals for their future. And as an adult who's there and cares enough to get into this environment, this teacher can absolutely have a lifelong positive impact on these students, even without the teacher training and a big range of ages and without content mastery. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, so you think that even though they're off to a rough start, the situation can be salvaged?
Right, like absolutely salvaged. And part of that stepping back is if they're looking at it and they're saying like, oh, I need to be a fully qualified, in the first week of school, I need to become a fully qualified teacher with content mastery and 2 years of teacher training and an expertise in every one of these K through 8 ages. That's not a practical goal, and that's not what should be aimed at either. But to take a step back and say, oh, I want to be a teacher who has good classroom management, who has a classroom where students behave well and are excited and respectful to come to class, and I can then eventually offer them art content that they enjoy for whatever reason they enjoy art. That's really important too. So, so for these practical steps, some of what I see in this situation, and we'll talk about it with the teachers starting fires, kind of the circle games and the craft stick games that we play to do it. But that idea of spending 5 or 10 minutes a day really building a strong culture, and creating some type of consistency. And that's one of the huge parts that we know from research works well with pretty much every group, and especially, it doesn't say at risk, but especially for me, the at-risk students, we talked about it all the time. But providing consistency in the classroom is incredibly important. And so that greeting students at the door, it can work, but only if students then have the self-control to come, and sit where they're supposed to. So what I see from here, and I don't know the seating arrangement, but right off the bat, I would start with assigned seating. And that lets this teacher break students into smaller groups, lets them, separate students that cause problems when they're together, especially kind of those older ages that maybe you can get the little cliques that are way too cool for school to help break that up. And then once you have these, I would suggest groups, because in an art environment, we had one staff member who used to almost kill themselves during summer camp, as you probably remember, running around trying to get supplies like for every student, and then running through the room and trying to hand out, craft sticks or trying to hand out feathers or whatever they were working with that day, instead of like master teachers who can stand at the front and have students, volunteer and excited to go and help out. But if you can break people into these groups or get assigned seating or do it by rows, however this art room is broken up, hopefully not in rows in an art room, you can then have a different, a table leader each day that's a little more responsible for the table. You can start to build a healthy sense of competition between the tables, cooperation at the table. But even just like if 10 minutes a day is spent getting people into their correct seats, but that builds that foundation, that's going to be a step further ahead for this
Right.
teacher.
Yeah, because for a lot of people think that a classroom needs to be a very linear structure, if linear is the right way to describe it, where the teacher is the director of all activity and all eyes are on the teacher the whole time. What you're describing is where the teacher is directing leaders who have groups, so that it's more of a tiered level of responsibility.
Yeah, or at least directing groups who have leaders. But if you can say like, all right, we need today's group leader to come forward and get these supplies. The group leader is responsible for making sure everybody, has cleaned up their area, responsible for making each table look good. I know when I worked with, especially the at-risk high school I was at, even though these students were like 15 to 22 sometimes, a surprising amount of effort and time was spent at the beginning of the year getting students used to sitting down without their phones out. And then I might have to take 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the day to get everybody to a spot where like their work is put away, they're cleaned up, they haven't left trash around, and then they were actually ready to leave when it was time. And it took a lot of effort, but at the end of a year, the students at that school knew which teachers you could have your phone out and text the whole class and not have an issue. And they also knew that in mine and several other teachers' classes, it just wasn't worth the trouble of having your phone out, and they would come in and put their phone away. And then I'd see those same students causing huge problems in other classes. But it's creating that consistency, creating, making it very clear that really those rules are essential. And in this, if these third graders really are causing this much trouble, I know one of the games I used to play that would always surprise parents, for a while worked with scout troops, and we'd have the fourth graders come in and we'd go talk about scouts in another room with the fourth graders, and the older scouts would give examples and we'd play some games. But by the end of it, they were having such a great time that, they were part of the team. And so I'd whisper, like loudly to them, like, all right, guys, do you want to see a really funny look on your parents' faces? And they're like, what? Oh yeah, I do. You're like, all right, do you really want to like really surprise your parents and freak them out? And they're like, what? Yeah, that sounds awesome. I was like, all right, we're going to play, the silent marching game, and you're going to stand like in a perfect line, and we're going to space out. And then you have to make sure that you're like all stepping your left foot together and your right foot together. And so like in only about 10-15 minutes, the parents see this like giant mass of fourth graders who are always these crazy Cub Scouts go into another room. And 15 minutes later, they come back like marching perfectly silently in a line past their parents to another room where we'd go play some other games. And, I always love seeing the parents just dumbfounded, but the kids, I didn't say like, all right, we have to be quiet and you have to, respect me and respect my authority. Instead, I made, silently marching in a line, a game that they were playing. And so that's one thing here is like not marching, but like start these classes with a silent minute, for whatever reason, and don't make it like, force them to be silent, but instead like every day, see if you can get a little further and put it up on the board even of like, which class is doing the best job for their silent minute, and, stretch it out. And then you have the second graders and you're like, if you do a little better today, you'll be almost like those fourth graders. And they're like, oh, that'd be amazing. Or the fourth graders, you can be like, dude, the second graders were quiet longer than you were. And see if you can even get like that silent minute down at the beginning of class and turn it into a game that you're part of as well, right? And then if you fail, it's like, oh man, we didn't make it today, but we'll try again tomorrow. And you start to have this positive pressure to behave well, instead of, that like silence is the enemy and all the students are fighting the teacher who's trying to get to this quiet environment.
Right. I like that a lot. So instead of coming from like the authoritarian perspective, like, you must obey me, you're creating an environment where they want to fulfill the expectation because of this other motivation. It's it's somehow more fun or more compelling to do what's expected of them rather than act out.
Right. Plus, I mean, if in those micro habits we try to build with our craft stick game or with the circle game especially, like you're building the habit of like the sort of the internal belief for these students that listening to the teacher leads to fun and good things. And if that's the habit that you get into, then you're more likely to listen in the future, or you build that positive relationship with the teacher.
I like this a lot. Okay, so we're talking about, it seems like a lot of what you're talking about right now are culture building activities that you can do in the beginning of class that help to build momentum towards having a well-behaved and well-disciplined class. You mentioned the silent minute. What else do you have that can help out in this way?
Yeah. And so I mean, we've got the two teacher starting fires activities that tie directly to this. So I can the craft stick one. You can just pull that video up for free and look at it and see what it is and try it out the next day. And especially in an art room, I imagine there are some craft sticks around. You can try it out, especially with some of the older students. The younger students, it might be a teamwork. It can be a little tricky for sure for like K through 3. But yeah, I mean, for this teacher walking into class the next day, if they're able to step back for a little bit and start to spend 5, 10, 15 minutes a day building this positive culture. The other thing I'm kind of imagining in this classroom just from the description is, I know when we teach anything and you have 40 kids or 80 kids were some of the classes at the camps, 80 kids scattered through the forest, there's no chance of teaching them, right? So you have to bring them in close. And in an art room, like whatever the space is, bring them in, get everybody around one table or have them in a circle, which is what we do for our games as well, of course. And start to build this like group community. And so like the teacher starting fires, the two activities we have, that first craft stick game, if you have 5 minutes and 5 craft sticks per person, as we always say, you can start to build a culture of engagement. And people who have heard a few of these, they might have heard the story before, but essentially at the at-risk high school I was at, there was always a student or two who, some had face tattoos or were out of juvie or were just the 14-year-old that was way too cool to do anything. And so they were going to fight you about everything. But this craft stick activity, essentially you have a certain shape, a form that you're trying to make with the craft sticks, and it is a physical puzzle. You put it together, you show everybody what it is, you let them try it out, and you step back. And this is what it has similar to art, right? That like you should be able to show something, step back, and have students helping each other to succeed as a group. But if they don't have that habit down, they're not going to naturally do it, right? So this craft stick game, you do it once or twice a week. And some students are going to master it. Some students, especially at the younger ages, are always going to struggle. There are a couple other shapes. There's a second shape that requires six craft sticks as well in the video. But if you show them this or, draw it just the shape on the board and have students work with it, then right during those first 5 or 10 minutes, the mini behaviors that you have these students practicing, you have a success, you have a micro victory. I've heard in some of the research now seems to be the new way to phrase that, but you have micro victories right at the beginning of class. So a student already gets that dopamine rush associated with succeeding in your class at a challenge. They get into the habit of trying, which is something every student can benefit from. They get into the habit of helping each other out without having to be told to. They have a sense of challenge. They have a sense of, as we'd say, adventure, but they're trying something new and exciting and different. And so, that's a benefit to have as well. So you can spend 5 or 10 minutes just with this craft stick activity alone. And this teacher, from the description has a long way to go. So I would not only do this, but, have students in their assigned seat, make it fun, but make it very expected that like, hey, you're going to be in your assigned seat before we can do anything. It's not negative, but just, oh man, you're not in your assigned seat. I can't do anything until you move. That's so unfortunate. And eventually they'll move over.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't something that's going to happen like tomorrow, like a magic pill. You come in and you hand out the popsicle sticks and everything is going according to plan, right? It's something to work towards.
Right.
And yeah.
Of course. Yeah. And there's a lot of layers to put it on. This is, out of magic pills. This might be the easiest pill to put out there. quickly. But yeah, to have it actually have the proper impact takes more than once. It takes more than just this one game. But if you can start to build a culture, and even, this little activity, though, gives your students 5 minutes of challenge and cooperation and collaboration and micro victories right at the beginning. And as other people succeed at this very simple, concrete task, it proves to each student that, like, oh, this is possible. I can keep at it. It's not some impossible math test or, an English essay. It's this very small, concrete activity, and I can do it right now. And then kind of our advanced level, of course, is the circle games, which, if you've tried out the craft stick or you're just ready to have a series of games to play with your students, you can completely change your culture. After only, a couple, the standard story on that, right, is that for a year and a half, I taught as the only science teacher at an at-risk school of 99% free and reduced lunch, and students would refer to each other with ethnic slurs, not even to be mean, but just out of just blatant ignorance about everybody's culture. And that was creating this really negative environment. And then a student came up and said, hey, my friend has my work. And I was like, all right, which friend? And they kind of described his face barely. And I realized that this person who he'd been sitting at a group table with for the last, semester and considered a friend, they didn't even know each other's first names. And that's when I realized, like, more than anything I can teach science-wise, I need to step back and build a positive foundation, a good framework, and then I can add this science siding on my education house, using that metaphor from before. But I can build this foundation. And so even though it was an hour class, and 10 minutes was required silent reading. So I took another 10 or 20 minutes each day. So I was losing half the class between reading and these circle games I would play. But within 2 or 3 weeks of doing this every day, I was the only teacher where every single student knew each other's names. And suddenly the students who had disliked each other, it was really hard to just generally dislike this other person because you referred to them by name every day. You interacted with them, you played catch with them, you succeeded as a team with the other members in your class. And so the behavior completely changed. And, this seems like a perfect class for those circle games where you can come in and have names built and have this foundation where you're part of the group and you're succeeding with your class and you're following the same rules, and they start to see you as a leader instead of kind of an authoritarian figure who they want to jump on and ignore.
Okay, and Jesse, as you're talking, I'm having kind of a psychic moment right now. I'm connecting with the person who wrote this question originally, and maybe for anybody else listening, right? I have these psychic moments sometimes, and they're thinking to themselves, this sounds great, but I have this one kid, or I have these 2 kids, and I just know that as soon as they get those craft sticks in their hands, they're going to be snapping them just to get a reaction from their friends. They're going to be throwing them across the room, and then it's just going to be chaos. What would you say to those people?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's 2 sides to that. One, to some extent, and this might be my own, like, at-risk background. To some extent, you do need to have support from the school and security and whatever that, we would have students who did make it very clear, like, they came in that day and they always had a reason, right? Whether something happened in their life or someone died or, sometimes it was drugs or alcohol related that day. There was some kind of justification, not a good one always, but there was a reason that they were acting out. But to some extent, like, if there's a student destroying property and throwing stuff through the room, you do need support from administration, and you need to be able to get them out of the classroom, right? But the student that's not, that's just breaking a couple sticks to see what your reaction is or to see what their friends are, the best thing to do there is treat it like you would more expensive supplies, where if you handed out expensive paintbrushes and some kids just broke them, like, you'd have a chat with them later. You wouldn't make a giant public display of it. But basically the next day you handed out paintbrushes, they wouldn't get one. And so, if you're doing this, there are going to be a large number of students who enjoy this, especially at that 6th through 8th grade, like, giant class level. There's going to be students who enjoy it. And then there will be students who don't want to participate, right? And so it's super easy. I would generally say, though, hand out your 5 craft sticks to every single student, your 5 or 6 craft sticks every day. If there's a student that doesn't participate, that's fine. 99% of the time, when they see that like you're really not watching them and everybody else is having fun trying this, they'll just jump in and try to figure it out. And half the time they're the ones that end up helping other people anyways. And then you might have that student who maliciously like breaks all your popsicle sticks and is like, what, you can't make me learn. And that's, you know, a conversation after school or on the side. And the conversation's more along the lines of like, hey, you know, I'm just trying to provide something fun for you, and I saw you broke all the popsicle sticks. That seems more than anything like you want to talk about something. Is there anything you want to talk about? And just make it clear that like they're not going to get you angry and riled up about it, but instead like, you know, they're going to get additional attention and see what goes on. And the next time they just don't get craft sticks. And, you know, and if they make a scene out of it, then you can just very clearly state like, hey, you damaged this last time, so you won't get any this time. But if you'd like to try again tomorrow, you can, and make it easy, right? Make it not a battle, but just very calmly assert your classroom rules and then enforce them.
I like that. And I like how somehow our conversations always, you know, go down this road of talking about teacher as coach and teacher as mentor rather than teacher as authoritarian figure who's in charge of training test-taking robots, right? So it's our mentality that's different.
Yeah, that's part of that teacher starting fire mindset, the adventure mindset. And that's the idea that if you are on, we always use the glacier crossing, right? That you're literally tied to 5 or 6 team members on a glacier, and you might be the person in front and you might have the most experience, but you might also be the person that falls into a crevasse and has to be rescued by your team. Or anybody on the team might fall in and everybody else has to rescue them. And even just the simpler version of like, you know, again, with this craft stick maliciously breaking thing, if you were out ice climbing and somebody just like cut their ice axe in half, the natural consequence is that they don't get to go ice climbing. And it's just that simple, you know, and if they're doing a lot of damage, they're going to owe you money. You know, or you're going to be talking to their parents about why they're breaking school supplies. If it's something really cheap and easy, like, you know, if they throw their food on the ground, they just don't get food the next meal. And then they realize like, oh, this is not an effective solution, and it'll change, right? And it's not done maliciously, but it's just done for the sake of the entire expedition. But yeah, like if you are outside on that glacier, you cannot authoritarianly demand everybody work as a team. You cannot use fear, you can't use intimidation, you can't use your detention power to make your team cross. You have to like genuinely believe they can cross and inspire them to cross and be part of the team that you're working with. And I think that's why the adventure mindset so naturally builds that sense of team membership for instructors, whereas I think kind of our just general culture does not do that for teachers as much, where you're more expected to be the, you know, the one authoritarian figure in the old schoolhouse with a ruler for knuckles.
Right. Yeah. This is the kind of thing that isn't necessarily taught in teacher school. So from that perspective, the person that posted this question is in a fine position to improve their classroom management skills and their classroom culture, and I think that they're going to do just fine.
Yeah, I mean, well, we don't know them, right? But they could do just fine. And I think letting go of those fears that like your lack of training and your range of ages and your lack of content mastery are going to stop you from being a great teacher. And keep in mind that like some of the most influential leaders and teachers that a lot of people have in their life are not formal teachers. They have uncles and nephews and scoutmasters and church leaders and, you know, team leaders and coaches and all that are some of the most influential people. And you can be that as this art teacher, this sort of, you know, like rotating between schools, K-8 art teacher. That is something that you can be, is this, you know, mentor that changes lives for this group. Yeah. And I think, again, to do that, fall back into like, be honest with yourself, try to be a team member with the class, being aware that you're the guide, and take those baby steps of, you know, assigned seats and maybe that silent minute a day and that craft stick game, that of course is at tsfires.com/stick. as in craft stick, tsfires.com/stick. You can also read more of our content at our blog, teachersstartingfires.com. And, we would love to have more and more teachers kind of join us on this journey of building up an adventure mindset with us.
Yeah, absolutely. If anybody listening to this right now has a question or wants to have a conversation with us or wants to direct our attention to a post or anything like that, they can send us an email at info@tsfires.com. And I think that goes to your email address, Jesse.
I think it does.
Yeah, so Jesse will respond to you promptly.
I'll keep an eye out for those.
Okay, so just in conclusion, and to wrap all of this up in a nice bow, a quick summary of some of the tips that Jesse gave. He recommended starting off with assigned seating and creating groups in the class. And I think that the teacher would be the one to assign these seats, not the students themselves, because then they would sit next to their buddies. And then starting the class with 5 to 10 minutes of culture building activities and baby steps with this. Don't start with more advanced activities. Do maybe a silent minute and write the stats up on the board so the different classes can see how their peers did, and they have kind of that friendly competition. They want to do better, and that's a way to motivate them to sit and be quiet, whereas normally if you just said sit and be quiet, they wouldn't necessarily want to do that. And then once the students have developed the ability to follow instructions to this level, then you can start to introduce some more advanced activities like the craft stick games or other games like that create this culture of creativity and problem solving and teamwork that we want to build in, not just in art class, but in any class too, right, Jesse? You could do this in science class or math or reading or in the library, or right?
Yeah, I mean, the entire Circle Games Adventure Pack curriculum was primarily created, probably 90% of it was created while I was, the head or the only science teacher at an at-risk charter school. And, I was able to accomplish in 30 minutes after 10 or 20 minutes of these circle games, I was able to accomplish in the remaining 30 minutes twice as much as I had in the full hour before, because students were engaged. They felt like they were part of class. They enjoyed what we were doing. And so they participated with everything else we were doing and followed the remaining instructions.
Yeah. And that reminds me of another thing. And I won't go too much into it because I think our episode is already getting towards the end. But just the idea that if any teacher listening to this thinks, oh, well, this sounds great, but I don't have enough time in my class. There's no way I can take out 5-10 minutes out of my class. I only have the kids for 50 minutes, something like that. Well, if you develop this culture in your classroom, then your students are going to perform better during their focused work time than they would have otherwise. So you'll actually get better results in less time than you would have because you've focused on building this foundation. Isn't that right, Jesse?
Right. I mean, especially for this, art teacher as an example, it was the same thing for me as a science teacher. But if you ask yourself, this week, do I want 50 minutes of absolute chaos that I'm barely keeping under control? Or do I want 30 minutes of well-behaved students and 30 minutes of games and activities that are designed to functionally build well-behaved students who are, engaged with what I'm doing? And I think most teachers, if they had to choose between, over a week, you get 5 hours of absolute chaos, or you get 2.5 hours of really orderly, well-maintained students who care about what they're doing, the 2.5 hours, you can accomplish a lot more and have a much better life as a teacher.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And with that, I think we're going to sign off. Thanks everybody for listening. If you want to learn more, go to tsfires.com. Check out the activities that we've been referencing at tsfires.com/stick. And you can always reach us at info@tsfires.com. Thanks a lot, and we hope to see you next time. And remember, as always, you're only one adventure away.